The chamber was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that comes before an explosion. Cameras clicked, pens hovered, and every eye in the room locked onto a single exchange. Alan Dershowitz, the storied lawyer with decades of courtroom swagger, leaning forward with a smirk that dripped of arrogance. His voice carried across the floor with that old familiar tone, condescending, assured, untouchable. He thought he had her cornered, that his years of reputation would bulldoze through a rising congresswoman from Texas. But then, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She leaned back, measured, her calm a thunderclap against the storm of smugness in front of her. She allowed him to finish his jab, his attempt at twisting her words into something they were not, his attempt at painting her as uninformed, unprepared, out of her depth. And as his last syllable echoed in the air, she tilted her head slightly, as though she'd just heard the most predictable note in the most tired song. It was in that tiny pause, that breath, that the energy of the room shifted. Viewers at home didn't need a degree in law or politics to feel it. They could sense it in their bones. Something was about to happen. Something that would shatter the illusion of untouchable power that Dershowitz wrapped around himself like a cloak. "Alan," she began, her voice smooth but edged with steel, "you've made a career out of talking down to people, but let's set the record straight. Today isn't your courtroom, and you're not the judge." The words hung in the air like a spark dangling over dry kindling. For a fraction of a second, Dershowitz's grin faltered. The audience caught it, the cameras caught it, and Twitter would replay it 1,000,000 times. This wasn't just another hearing. This was theater. This was a clash of worlds. Old guard arrogance versus new generation fire. It was dignity against condescension. Truth against distortion. Crockett wasn't here just to survive the exchange. She was here to rewrite the narrative, to remind America that respect and strength don't belong only to the loudest voice in the room. And as her eyes locked onto him with unflinching resolve, the nation leaned closer to its screens. They didn't want to miss what came next. Because if this was the opening, the next moment promised to leave the country in disbelief. Long before this clash unfolded, the tension had been building like pressure beneath the surface of a fault line. Alan Dershowitz wasn't just another lawyer with opinions. He was a figure who had spent decades entrenching himself in America's most polarizing legal battles. To some, he was a defender of constitutional principles. To many others, he was the embodiment of elitism, a man who cloaked arrogance under the guise of intellect, a man who often used his platform to belittle those who dared challenge him. And across from him stood Jasmine Crockett, young, unafraid, unapologetically black, unapologetically Southern, unapologetically herself. Her very presence in that room symbolized a shift. She represented an America still fighting for its promises. The America that had been silenced, underestimated, and overlooked for too long. For her constituents, for countless viewers across the nation, she wasn't just Jasmine Crockett. She was the voice of a people tired of being told they didn't belong at the table. That was what made this moment electric. This wasn't simply an argument over procedure or interpretation. This was identity colliding with privilege. It was the struggle of dignity facing down decades of entrenched power. The stakes weren't about who could out-debate the other. It was about who represented the future of America. Dershowitz's smirk wasn't just personal condescension. It was symbolic of a broader narrative, one that had for generations dismissed women, dismissed immigrants, dismissed people of color, dismissed anyone who didn't fit neatly into the narrow corridors of old power. And Crockett's poised rebuttal wasn't just a defense. It was a declaration. It was a signal that the walls of exclusion were cracking. Viewers watching from living rooms and smartphones felt it. Every immigrant who had ever been told their accent made them less American. Every young woman of color who had been dismissed in a meeting. Every working-class citizen who had been lectured by the powerful. All of them saw themselves in Crockett's. Silence before she spoke, in the steel behind her eyes. And here's why it mattered for justice. Because America isn't simply defined by laws written on paper, but by who gets to speak those laws aloud, who gets to interpret them, who gets to challenge them. For too long, the courtroom, and by extension the halls of political debate, had been dominated by voices like Dershowitz's. What the country witnessed in this chamber wasn't just a verbal spar. It was a reshuffling of authority, a reminder that truth doesn't always come with a Harvard degree. The air grew taut with expectation because the audience sensed something bigger than words was at play. This was about reclaiming the American narrative. This was about proving that arrogance doesn't equal wisdom, that confidence built on exclusion crumbles when faced with authenticity rooted in lived experience. And Crockett? She wasn't merely defending herself. She was holding a mirror up to America. She was saying, look at who gets dismissed, look at who gets erased, look at who you've underestimated, but also, look at who refuses to be silenced. The nation leaned in not just because they wanted to see a sparring match, but because deep down they understood the weight of this confrontation. This was bigger than two people at a table. This was about the kind of America we choose to be, one that clings to the arrogance of privilege, or one that embraces the dignity of truth. But what happened next, what unfolded as the clash deepened, would ignite the room in a way no one could have predicted. To understand why this clash struck such a nerve, we have to step back and look at the man sitting across from Jasmine Crockett. Alan Dershowitz was not a newcomer. For decades, he had carved out a space for himself at the center of America's most contentious legal and political debates. His resume gleamed with high-profile cases, his books filled shelves, his appearances dominated news cycles. To some, this made him an oracle of constitutional law. To others, it made him a caricature of what happens when power goes unchecked for too long. Because Dershowitz's story isn't one of pure brilliance. It's one of contradictions. He was a man who styled himself as a defender of civil liberties, yet repeatedly aligned himself with figures whose legacies rested on undermining those very liberties. He was the lawyer who lectured America about justice while appearing to twist the very definition of it, depending on who was signing the check. He thrived in chaos, often inserting himself into debates not to illuminate truth, but to remind people of his relevance. This arrogance had become his trademark. He wore it as comfortably as a tailored suit. When he walked into a room, there was always that air of expectation. He believed people should listen simply because his name was Alan Dershowitz. His tone carried the weight of a man who had long grown used to deference, used to others shrinking beneath the shadow of his credentials. And yet, beneath that veneer of intellectual superiority, cracks had always shown. Critics pointed out the hypocrisy in his stances. A man who had fought for certain rights with ferocity while dismissing or undermining others. He spoke eloquently about protecting freedoms, but often seemed to reserve his passion for clients and causes that benefited the elite. He claimed the moral high ground, while his career choices suggested that power, not principle, often guided his path. This was the man Jasmine Crockett faced, a man who embodied an era where arrogance could be mistaken for authority, where condescension could masquerade as wisdom. And on this day, he believed history would repeat itself. He believed his words, sharpened by decades of courtroom theatrics, would silence a younger, less experienced opponent. He thought the game was already won before it began. But here's the flaw in that confidence. Arrogance blinds. It convinces you that the world hasn't changed, that the same tricks will always work, that your dominance is eternal. What Dershowitz didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that America had shifted. The audiences that once bowed their heads to elite voices were no longer so easily swayed. Social media had democratized influence. Communities that had been ignored for generations had found their collective voice. And a woman like Jasmine Crockett was not about to crumble under the weight of old arrogance. This set up the perfect storm for a downfall. Because arrogance in itself doesn't guarantee defeat, but arrogance combined with hypocrisy, combined with underestimating your opponent, creates the conditions for collapse. Dershowitz didn't just walk into that chamber with confidence. He walked in with baggage. Years of contradictory stances, years of dismissive rhetoric, years of leaning on reputation rather than accountability. The audience watching him wasn't neutral. They carried the memory of every moment he had stood on the wrong side of history, and the contradictions were glaring. Here was a man who had spent decades insisting on the importance of truth in the courtroom, yet in this exchange, he distorted Crockett's words for rhetorical gain. Here was a man who lectured about respect for institutions, yet often used his platform to tear down those who challenged his narrative. He positioned himself as a scholar of fairness, yet his own career choices revealed a pattern of siding with power over principle. Every smirk, every raised eyebrow, every dismissive interruption only magnified the chasm between who he claimed to be and who he revealed himself to be in practice. And that is why this moment was not just another exchange. It was the slow unraveling of an image, because the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. And Dershowitz had built his pedestal taller than most. He believed it made him untouchable. But as America leaned in to watch, it became clear that his contradictions had finally caught up with him. The stage was set, the cracks exposed, and his opponent wasn't intimidated. She was prepared. What came next wouldn't just challenge his arguments. It would shake the very foundation of his carefully curated legacy. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's voice carried such weight in that chamber, you have to know where she came from. Unlike Alan Dershowitz, who walked into rooms already armed with the privilege of reputation, Crockett's journey had been one of grit, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of dignity in spaces designed to shut her out. Born in St. Louis, raised in the working-class South, Jasmine grew up seeing the disconnect between America's promises and the realities her community lived every day. She witnessed families working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, schools struggling for resources, and voices like hers, black, female, unapologetically bold, too often dismissed as too much or out of place. These early lessons etched themselves into her spirit. If she wanted to change the system, she would have to walk straight into its halls, no matter how hostile they were. Her path to politics wasn't paved with ease. Before she was ever a congresswoman, Crockett was a public defender. And that mattered, because while Dershowitz spent his career representing the powerful, she spent hers defending those who had none. She walked into courtrooms on behalf of people who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers, people society wrote off before they even spoke, people whose humanity was often reduced to a case number on a docket. And every time she stood at their side, she learned how to fight, not with arrogance, but with conviction. Those experiences hardened her resolve, but also deepened her empathy. She saw firsthand the ways systems failed ordinary people, especially people of color. She saw how a biased glance from a judge or a dismissive remark from an attorney could alter the trajectory of someone's life. And she vowed that if she ever had a larger platform, she would use it not for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. That's what made her entry into Congress so significant. Crockett didn't run for office out of ambition alone. She ran because she knew what was at stake. She knew how laws on paper translated into lives in the margins. She knew that representation wasn't just symbolic, it was essential. For every young girl watching her rise, for every immigrant family waiting to be recognized, for every community told to wait just a little longer for justice, Crockett's victory meant a piece of America's promise had been reclaimed, and yet her authenticity often became a weapon used against her. Critics tried to dismiss her as too fiery, too blunt, too emotional. They tried to box her into the stereotypes reserved for black women who dared to speak with authority. But Crockett didn't shrink. She leaned into it. She refused to code switch to make others comfortable, refused to water down her truth to fit someone else's narrative. For her, dignity meant not apologizing for existing exactly as she was. This was what uniquely prepared her for the confrontation with Dershowitz, because she had spent her entire life being underestimated. She had spent her career navigating spaces where power sneered at her presence. Every smirk from a judge, every interruption in a courtroom, every side-eye in a political chamber. She had seen it all before. Where others might falter under condescension, Crockett thrived. Because she had learned to turn dismissal into fuel, and arrogance into the spark that lit her fire. And here was the irony. Dershowitz thought his decades of experience gave him the upper hand. In reality, it gave Crockett the perfect stage. His arrogance played directly into the narrative she had battled against for years. His dismissal of her wasn't new, it was centuries old. And in standing tall against him, she wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for generations. That's why the audience connected to her so deeply. They didn't just see a congresswoman, they saw themselves. They saw the young woman told she was too loud in a classroom. They saw the immigrant father who had been talked down to at a government office. They saw the black family dismissed in a neighborhood meeting. Crockett's strength wasn't abstract, it was lived. And that lived strength made her not only resilient, but unshakable. So when she squared her shoulders, looked across the table and stared down Dershowitz's smug grin, the moment carried more than political drama. It carried the weight of her journey. Every courtroom battle for the voiceless, every night spent preparing cases that the world ignored, every dismissal turned into determination. All of it led here. And what Dershowitz didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated, was that Crockett was the kind of opponent who thrived in the very moments he thought would undo her. He thought the weight of his reputation would crush her. Instead, it only elevated her, spotlighting the very resilience that had brought her this far. For the millions watching, it became clear. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the embodiment of America's crossroads. On one side, the old arrogance of privilege. On the other, the relentless dignity of a new generation refusing to be silenced. And if the opening moments of this confrontation had left the nation leaning closer, Crockett's presence made one thing undeniable. The best was yet to come. Because, when the debate escalated, she wasn't just going to defend herself, she was going to dismantle everything Dershowitz thought untouchable. The room was no longer quiet. The opening jabs had set the stage, but now the tension erupted into a volley of exchanges that felt less like a polite debate and more like a courtroom drama unfolding before a live audience. Alan Dershowitz leaned in, his voice rising, his words sharpened into barbs meant to pierce through Jasmine Crockett's calm. He dismissed her points with theatrical sighs, waved his hand as though swatting away a child's argument, and doubled down on the arrogance that had carried him for decades. But this time, something was different. His voice, usually so commanding, carried an edge of desperation. Each rebuttal grew louder, more frantic, as if sheer volume could mask the hollowness of his logic. His rhythm faltered, his once polished delivery slipping into stammers and interruptions. He repeated himself, circled back to the same talking points, the same distortions, hoping repetition would force acceptance. Yet the cracks in his composure were unmistakable. And across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, steady, composed, unshaken. While Dershowitz gestured wildly, she remained poised, her tone measured. Where he raised his voice, she lowered hers, cutting sharper with calm than he could with fury. Her body language spoke volumes. She was not flustered, not intimidated. In fact, the more he pressed, the more her silence between words made the room lean toward her. Each exchange painted the contrast more vividly. Dershowitz embodied the arrogance of power unraveling under pressure. Crockett embodied dignity holding its ground, refusing to be moved. The tension wasn't simply in what was said, it was in what the audience saw. The old guard rattled, the new voice unbreakable. He tried to corner her with legal jargon, weaving technicalities into traps. But Crockett refused to play his game. She responded not with jargon, but with clarity, stripping away his complexity and exposing the flimsy core beneath it. Each time she spoke, she didn't just answer him. She dismantled the foundation of his argument, brick by brick. And with each dismantling, the smirk on his face grew thinner. The audience felt the shift. What had begun as a battle of intellect was now a battle of composure. Dershowitz's mask of superiority was slipping. The great lawyer, the man who once commanded respect through his name alone, looked less like a titan and more like a cornered figure trying to maintain control. And Crockett? She looked like someone who had been here before, who had faced worse storms and learned how to stand firm through them all. Social media was already buzzing. Clips of the back and forth began circulating, captions framing it as the fall of arrogance and the rise of resilience. Hashtags started to trend as viewers shared snippets of Dershowitz's stumbles, paired with Crockett's steady responses. The digital tide was turning even as the debate continued, but Crockett wasn't done. The calm she carried wasn't just composure, it was preparation. She was waiting for the right moment, the precise opening to deliver the blow that would not only silence the arrogance across from her, but also electrify the nation watching. Every pause, every measured response was building toward something, and Dershowitz, blinded by his unraveling temper, couldn't see it. He believed he was still in control, still the dominant voice. He didn't realize that the more he shouted, the more he revealed his weakness. He didn't realize that the very performance he thought would crush his opponent was actually setting the stage for his undoing. Because what came next wasn't just another rebuttal. It wasn't just a counterpoint. It was the moment Jasmine Crockett would flip the script entirely. The moment where calm turned into fire, where dignity transformed into a mic drop so powerful, it would ripple across the nation. And as the chamber braced for the next words to fall, viewers everywhere knew instinctively, the real explosion was still to come. The silence before her words landed was deafening. Alan Dershowitz had just finished another tirade, his voice cracking under the weight of his own desperation, and he leaned back in his chair with a self-satisfied grin, convinced he had cornered Jasmine Crockett. But that grin would soon collapse into something else entirely. Crockett let the silence linger. Seconds ticked by, long enough for the tension to thicken, long enough for the cameras to close in on her steady gaze. She didn't rush, didn't stumble. When she finally spoke, her words cut sharper than any shout ever could. "Alan," she began, her tone low but resolute, "your entire strategy has been to talk over me, to dismiss me, to pretend that arrogance is the same thing as wisdom. But let me remind you, this country isn't built on arrogance. It's built on accountability. And right now, you're showing America exactly why accountability matters." The chamber shifted. Heads turned. The smirk on Dershowitz's face faltered just slightly, as though he hadn't expected to be called out so directly. Crockett pressed on, her voice calm but unyielding. "You claim to stand for truth, yet every word you've thrown at me has been about distortion, twisting what I've said, trying to box me in, hoping that if you raise your voice loud enough, people will mistake volume for clarity. But let me make this plain. Your reputation doesn't make you right, and your condescension doesn't make me wrong." The audience erupted with murmurs, a ripple of acknowledgement moving across the chamber. The nation watching could feel it. This was the pivot, the precise moment when the ground beneath Dershowitz's feet began to crumble. She leaned in, narrowing the distance between them. Her eyes locked onto his with the unflinching intensity of someone who had spent her whole life standing firm against men who tried to talk her down. "You've made a career out of speaking for power," she said, her voice steady. "I've made a career out of standing with people who had none. And that difference right there, that's why America is listening to me tonight. Not you. The words landed like a thunderclap. Dershowitz shifted in his chair, his fingers fidgeting with his pen. For the first time, the confidence that had carried him into this room began to visibly unravel. His mouth opened as though to respond, but no words came. Crockett let the silence speak louder than any interruption. She paused again, allowing the weight of her statement to hang in the air, giving the audience time to absorb every syllable. And then, with precision honed from years of courtroom battles, she delivered the blow. You can call me inexperienced. You can call me emotional. You can throw every tired stereotype you've got. But what you can't do is erase the truth I bring with me. Because unlike you, I don't need to twist words to stand my ground. I live my truth. And I refuse to let men like you silence it. The chamber gasped. Twitter exploded in real time. Hashtags ignited. Crockett clapped back. Truth over arrogance. Mic drop moment. And still, she wasn't finished. I know why you talk down to me, Alan. It's not because I lack understanding. It's because my very presence here terrifies you. Because I represent a generation that won't bow to old power. I represent voices that you've spent a lifetime ignoring. I represent an America that doesn't look to you for permission to speak, and that scares you more than any argument I could ever make. Dershowitz blinked, his eyes darting as though searching for a lifeline. The man who once dominated courtrooms with quick wit and bravado now looked cornered, stripped of his usual armor. The camera zoomed in, catching the beads of sweat at his temple. His smirk was gone. Crockett's tone softened, not weaker, but sharper in its restraint. You see, arrogance always thinks it wins. It believes the loudest voice is the strongest. But history shows us something different. History shows us that arrogance falls and dignity endures. And right now, Alan, America is watching your arrogance crumble. The room erupted, some with applause, some with stunned silence, some with whispered exclamations that carried across the chamber. On social media, clips of her takedown flooded timelines. Commentators scrambled to frame the moment. The young congresswoman just dismantled a legal giant in real time. Memes, GIFs, hashtags poured in. Celebrities and activists retweeted her lines within minutes. And while the noise outside the room grew, inside the chamber, Dershowitz sat shrinking. His rebuttals had evaporated. His carefully cultivated image, decades of authority, dominance, reputation, had been punctured in a single devastating exchange. Crockett leaned back, not triumphant in tone but resolute, her final words cutting through the air like the strike of a gavel. America doesn't belong to arrogance. It belongs to all of us, and I'll never stop reminding you of that. The cameras caught it all. The look on Dershowitz's face, the wave of recognition sweeping the audience, the shift in power that could no longer be denied. And as the murmurs filled the room, as phones buzzed with notifications across the nation, one truth was clear. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She had flipped the entire narrative, turning what was meant to be a dismissal into a defining victory. But even as the crowd reeled from her words, the real story was only beginning. Because the aftermath, the ripple effects across media, politics, and public conversation would turn this mic drop moment into something much bigger. Something that would leave the country buzzing for weeks. And what happened next would prove that this wasn't just a takedown. It was a cultural earthquake. The moment Jasmine Crockett's final words echoed through the chamber, the world outside erupted. Within seconds, the clip was clipped, shared, remixed, and captioned. Twitter lit up first, a digital wildfire spreading across timelines. The hashtags that had sparked during the debate now blazed at the top of trending. Crockett clapped back, truth over arrogance. Chakr mic drop moment. Within an hour, her takedown video had millions of views, accompanied by captions like, She didn't just win, she changed the game. Memes followed like an unstoppable flood. A split screen of Dershowitz sweating contrasted with Crockett's unflinching gaze, gifs of her delivery. Every pause, every pointed glare, looped endlessly, turned into rallying cries for a generation hungry for authenticity. TikTok creators stitched her lines into rap remixes, while Instagram flooded with carousel posts, quoting her sharpest sentences in bold letters over photos of her standing strong. And it wasn't just digital noise, it was resonance. Young voters began posting selfies under the hashtag Crockett Clapback, declaring, "This is why we fight. This is the voice we've been waiting for." She spoke for all of us tonight. Older activists, veterans of past political struggles, tweeted words they hadn't used in years: hope, pride, renewal. Mainstream media couldn't look away. By dawn the next morning, every major outlet replayed the exchange on loop. Anchors leaned forward in their chairs, voices tinged with awe as they replayed her mic drop moment. CNN called it the rhetorical knockout of the decade. The New York Times ran a headline: Crockett's clapback echoes across America. Even international outlets, from the BBC to Al Jazeera, ran features framing it as a turning point in American political discourse. Celebrities joined in with lightning speed. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "Sis didn't just defend herself, she defended an entire generation." John Legend posted a video of the clip with the caption, "When truth sings, arrogance trembles." From Hollywood actors to hip-hop artists, Crockett's words became the soundtrack of the moment, quoted in interviews, echoed at concerts, emblazoned across merch in online shops by the end of the week. But perhaps the most powerful ripple came from everyday citizens. Teachers in immigrant-heavy classrooms told their students about the moment, holding it up as proof that their voices mattered. Community organizers cut the clip into short reels and blasted it on projectors during neighborhood meetings. Churches replayed it during youth nights. In barbershops, in grocery store lines, in subway cars, the moment became a shorthand for defiance, courage, and belonging. Meanwhile, on the other side of the political spectrum, the backlash was fierce and telling. Conservative pundits scrambled to discredit her. They mocked her tone, her youth, her audacity. But their clips, clipped and reposted by Crockett's supporters, only fueled her legend. Every insult hurled at her became proof of exactly what she had said, that her presence terrified those who clung to fading power. And Dershowitz? The man who once thrived on endless commentary found himself cornered. His attempted rebuttals on cable news fell flat, drowned out by the viral soundbites of Crockett's takedown. In one interview, he stumbled, accusing her of being performative. The clip went viral again, this time with captions like, "Imagine calling truth performative." He was no longer the narrative's author. He was its cautionary tale. Politicians couldn't ignore the storm either. Progressive leaders praised her publicly, calling her the new standard of courage. Younger representatives began quoting her words in their own speeches, weaving her clapback into a broader fight for justice. Even those who had kept their distance before, worried about rocking the establishment, now found themselves aligning with her energy. But perhaps most striking were the quiet messages that began surfacing. Screenshots circulated of text messages from immigrant parents to their children. "She speaks for us. Don't let anyone silence you." Letters poured into her office from people she had never met. Farm workers, nurses, single parents, each one echoing the same sentiment. "Thank you for saying what we felt for so long." The ripple effect wasn't confined to the political sphere. Late-night comedians built entire monologues around the exchange, mocking Dershowitz while lionizing Crockett. Pop culture shows debated the moment, framing it as not just political theater, but cultural transformation. The line between politics and identity between power and resistance, blurred until her mic drop wasn't just a debate moment. It was a cultural earthquake. And as the wave grew, so did the anticipation. If Crockett could do this in one night, in one room, what could she do with the weight of a movement behind her? What battles could she take on next? The nation wasn't just reacting. They were waiting, eyes locked on her next move, because what began as a clapback was no longer just about her versus Dershowitz. It was about the future of who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and who gets to be heard in America. And as the shockwaves rippled outward, one thing was certain. This was not the end of the story. It was the spark of something far greater. When the noise finally settled, when the hashtags slowed from a roar to a steady pulse, Jasmine Crockett rose once more. Not on the debate stage, not in front of cameras, but in the quiet resolve of someone who understood the weight of what had just happened. She knew this was bigger than a single exchange with Alan Dershowitz. It was bigger than one night's victory. It was about the story America tells itself, and the story America needs to tell moving forward. Her words, replayed endlessly, began to shift in tone. No longer just clapbacks or viral punches, they became parables. She reframed the moment not as proof of her own strength, but as proof of a deeper truth. Arrogance cannot withstand authenticity. The weight of centuries of entitlement cannot silence even one clear, unwavering voice rooted in justice. At rallies, she didn't dwell on Dershowitz or his stumble. Instead, she looked out at the faces of young immigrants, of children who had been told their names were too hard to pronounce, of women who had been told to soften their tone. What happened on that stage, she told them, was not about me defeating him. It was about showing you that you have always had the power to speak your truth. Don't wait for permission. Don't shrink. The world needs you unfiltered, unafraid, and unapologetic. The lesson resonated because it pierced through cynicism. Too many had grown weary of politics as a game of insults and money. But Crockett's moment reminded them that moral clarity still mattered, that dignity could win against derision, that courage still carried weight. Her voice became a symbol not just of defiance, but of a path forward, where the measure of leadership was not arrogance, not pedigree, not self-promotion, but the ability to connect, to uplift, to affirm the humanity of those too often ignored. And perhaps the most radical truth she offered was simple. The fight for justice does not belong to the loudest or the most privileged. It belongs to those who endure, who love, who persist despite being told they are less than. She turned her personal resilience into a collective anthem, reminding America that its greatness was never in the hands of a few men defending power, but in the millions who refused to be erased. Even her opponents could not escape the echo. For all their mocking, for all their attempts to reduce her to a moment, the clarity of her words haunted them. Because deep down, they understood what the world had witnessed. Arrogance was fragile. It cracked under the light of truth, and once shattered, it could never again carry the same authority. As the weeks passed, her speeches closed with a refrain. We do not rise by silencing others. We rise by lifting each other. It became a mantra, scrawled on protest signs, painted on murals, whispered in classrooms. It was not just Crockett's victory. It was everyone's. The young woman who stood her ground had offered America a mirror, and in that reflection, millions saw not division, but possibility. And so, the story resolved not with Dershowitz's downfall or Crockett's triumph alone, but with a moral lesson that cut across every identity, every border. Arrogance is temporary. Moral clarity endures, because in the end, this was never just a clapback. It was a reminder that truth, spoken with courage, can bend history itself. And so the title of this story, When Jasmine Crockett Silenced Alan Dershowitz, was never really about silence. It was about voice, a voice that refused to be diminished. A voice that carried every overlooked struggle, every unspoken truth, and turned them into a force that could not be ignored. Moments like this remind us why we watch, why we listen, why we share. Because deep down, we're not just consuming a clip, we're witnessing a shift. A shift in how power is challenged, in how arrogance is unmasked, in how courage can ignite millions of hearts at once. This wasn't just Crockett versus Dershowitz. It was every immigrant child told they don't belong, every worker dismissed by those in power, every woman underestimated, every community mocked. And in that moment, when she stood steady and struck back with moral clarity, she didn't just win an argument, she validated a movement. That's why this story matters, and why it can't stop here. If you felt the spark, if you believe arrogance should never overshadow justice, then don't let this be where it ends. Carry it forward. Share this with someone who needs that reminder today. Subscribe so you don't miss the next moment where truth pierces through the noise, because this isn't just about watching history, it's about shaping it. And together, we can make sure voices like Jasmine Crockett's don't just echo in one chamber, but resound across a nation hungry for clarity, courage, and change. The fight isn't finished. But after tonight, we know one thing for certain. Arrogance can fall, and truth, when spoken boldly, will always rise. For more updates like this, please do subscribe this channel and press the bell button so that you can get notified whenever a new upload available. Thanks for watching.